But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit, verse 26, we must be cast upon a certain island. Now, if you look at verse number 22, he says, we're all going to live. There's not going to be a loss of life, but the end of verse number 22, there is going to be a loss of the ship. So the ship we're on is not going to survive. Down to verse number 26, he says the same thing. However, we're going to live, I believe God, but the ship is going to be cast upon a certain island. And so I want us to imagine this morning a scale. And so on this side of the scale, we have promises, a promise of God. That's what's in verse 22 to 25. And on this side of the scale are circumstances. So you have a promise here and circumstances here. And so I want to give the title of this in the form of a question. And the question is this: how much does the promise weigh? How much does the promise weigh? So let's look at that this morning. Lord, we thank you for your word. Thank you for your goodness. And we ask that you have your hand on the service today. We'll give you the glory for it. In Jesus' name, amen. And you can be seated. Thank you for standing. I want to remind us, before we jump back to the story, of the book of Esther. Many are familiar with the story of Esther. Esther being a young Jewish woman who, for sake of time, we're not going to go into the story, but let's just say that she became queen in a very unusual way. And so she ends up being the queen. The king does not know that she's Jewish. That's the secret of it all. And so he doesn't know that she is Jewish. Well, then a decree is written by a man by the name of Haman that on a certain day, all the Jews can be attacked and all the Jews can be killed. And so that is the setup for Esther. Well, Mordecai, the one who raised Esther, sends a letter to her and warns her. And he warns her in this way: think not that with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. So Esther is faced with this situation. She is the queen, but Mordecai is warning her, don't think that just because you're the queen, that this decree will not come after you also. So their hatred of the Jewish people at that time, the hatred of the Jewish people was stronger than their love for the fact that she's queen. And if you know the story of Esther, you know that's true by the way the last queen got dismissed. And so Esther has this weighing on her mind that she probably will not escape. And so he urges her to go to the king and to let him know that she's a Jew, but more importantly, try to save her people. So that's what she's faced with. So she's faced with this tough choice of, do I remain silent and hope that I will survive, or do I risk talking to the king? And we know the law at the time, the queen was not allowed to go to the king without invitation. And so when Esther goes to the king and says she wants to see him, he can either lift his scepter and say it's okay, she can come in, or he could say that she is breaking the law and she could be done away with, just like the Queen Vashti who was before her. And so she has this dilemma in her mind, and we're gonna say it this way, it's the way we say it today. She was weighing pros and cons. She was putting the end results on a scale, if you would. If I go before the king, here's what could happen. If I do not go before the king, here's what could happen. And I think we can all understand what that's like. And we make decisions in life, maybe not to the extent that Esther saw it, as the consequences for her decision was very heavy. But she's faced with this choice, and so we're going to imagine that she puts these decisions on a scale. Well, we know, according to Esther chapter 4, in verse 16, she sends a letter back to her uncle Mordecai, who says, so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. That great line in the book of Esther. And so she puts her choices on a scale and says, when I look at the risk, one, I may save my life, but we lose everybody else's. Really, the only option of saving everyone's life is to go before the king. And if I perish, I perish. And so, as we know, the king does welcome her in, and the Lord uses her in a great way. And we know that she was there for such a time as this, that great line, that theme of Esther. As I think about this idea of what we put on a scale, I'm thinking even in the sense of Esther. You know, one side offered hope, but the other side offered a different hope. One required faith, the other one required a different type of faith. And so there's all these things that are being balanced on this scale. And then I think of in my own life, and maybe you're not this way, but for me, it seems like I don't walk around perfectly balanced scale. It seems like some days, each day is different, some days I lean towards seeing the negative. I mean, it doesn't matter what happens. You're in a bad mood. I don't know what the wrong side of the bed is, but I've woken up on it a few times. And things are kind of, not the way they ought to be. You feel tense. You don't feel like you're sharp in your mind and just things. And then other days I'm overly optimistic. And nothing wrong could happen today. Everything's fine and everything's going to be fine. And so we have this scale that we kind of walk around with. It's our emotions, it's our actions, it's decisions that we make. We're weighing pros and cons, and we're just trying to find the right balance that allows us to move forward. But I don't want to necessarily look at our actions being on a scale today, but I want to look at our attitude. Our attitude being on a scale. In our text, Paul is laying out for us the scenario that he was in. He has this scenario where they are in a ship. It's a very difficult storm. Paul warned them not to go, but they didn't listen. And so on this scale of Paul, on one side, as we mentioned in the beginning, we have verse 22 through 25. So if you can imagine that, on this side of the scale, there's these verses, verse 22 to 25, and that is a promise from God. That's what he has. Now keep in mind, this is not a promise that was written down in Scripture. It's a promise that the Lord told him personally, and he says, I believe it. I believe God's going to fulfill this promise. And so he has a promise over here, and the promise is we're all going to live. We're going to survive the storm. So that's what's on this side. Well, then on this side of the scale, we have verse number 26, and we'll throw in here the last part of verse number 22, and that is the ship is going to be destroyed. So I have two things that I have to weigh out. One, I have a promise that I'm going to live, but I also know that the ship I'm on is going to crash. Well, that's a difficult thing to kind of separate. And so we would understand the nervousness, the anxiety, the struggle that might come with that. And then if you look at the wording of verse number 26, he says this. He says that they're going to be cast upon a certain island. And so they don't even know which island it's going to be. Well, which island are we going to crash on? I don't know. Which island's going to destroy the ship? We don't know. Is there going to be people there? Is this going to be an inhabited island? I don't know. but we're going to crash upon an island. And so we could say this: we have the first circumstances that you're going to crash, but then all of the uncertainties are adding weight to this side of the scale. Because it's the unknown. How many times have we heard people say, it's the unknown that bothers me the most? It's the things that I am uncertain of. It's just not knowing. And so you have an uncertain island, and so it adds weight to this side. And I thought about giving the title to this message, An Old Promise, but New Circumstances. Because when we think about the promises that God has given us, we don't have new promises. It's the same old promises. And yet all through life, there are circumstances that continually add on to that side of the scale. And there's not new promises given to us. We can learn new promises, we can study, we can find confidence. But it's the same old promise, but it seems like in life, the circumstances of life just seem to pile on at times. And so it's an uncertain island. Well, notice also, he doesn't say how long it's going to take to crash into the island. In fact, look at verse number 27, the very first thing he says after this. But when the 14th night was come, 14 nights later, it still hasn't happened. Still in a storm, still on the boat. I still have a promise, but every day the intensity builds on, the anxiety builds on, the uncertainty builds on. And so I have on this side, verse 26, but I also have uncertainty of a place, I have uncertainty of a time, and this side is starting to get heavy. I think we would all recognize that it's possible to reach a point where we have God's promise here and circumstances of life here, and we're walking just balanced just fine. But then it seems like there are times when things get added to the circumstance side. There's times when it seems like the uncertainty, the unknown, the difficulties, and all of a sudden we know the promise is there. That is not a question. We know the promise is there. We're not debating that. We're not struggling with that. We know the promise is there, but yet if we're going to be honest, the circumstances right now seem to be heavier than the promise. It seems to be more of my focus, more of my mind, and I am struggling. And so now, instead of walking in the hope of a promise, if I'm going to be honest, I'm walking in the uncertainty of my circumstance. And so this side really starts getting a lot of attention. So let me ask you, if this is you, you're on this ship. You have the promise from Paul that you're going to live, but you are on a ship in a storm, 14 days, knowing you're going to crash. You know you better than I would know you. So ask yourself, at this point, which side weighs more? Are you finding comfort in the promise, or are you finding worry in the circumstances? So this is where we are in verse number 26 and verse number 27. However, it seems like things continually get added to the circumstance side. So look at verse number 29. We're going to add to this. They go for a little while, and then it says this, then fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks. So the island that they come to, knowing, keep in mind, you've already been told you're going to crash into an island. Well, then the island that you are approaching is not sand. There's no beach. It's rocks. And so now they are fearful to the point that they cast anchor. They don't want the boat to crash. They don't, even though they've been told it's going to happen, they don't want it to. This island is too rough, it's too dangerous, the rocks that are here, and so they throw out anchor, they're not sure what to do. And so now we're going to add to, not to the promise side, it's still just the one promise, but we're going to add to the circumstance side and say not only now do we know that we're going to crash, we also know this is a very rocky island, this is not going to be good. The danger level just increased. And And so now the difficulty of the journey gets added. I think of many people that we've known and that you know that might get word of a physical, maybe disease, a sickness, something, and so they get that news and it's added to their life. And at that point in time, there's a lot of uncertainty. What's this going to look like? What's going to happen? And what does this mean for me? Well, then sometimes the more you learn, it doesn't make things easier. Sometimes the more you learn, we learn this is not going to be fun. This is going to bring about pain or sickness, or maybe the outlook doesn't look good. And so the more we learn, it seems like we still have the promise, but there's nothing being added to the promise. But there's a lot being added to our circumstance. And so now for them, they are approaching this island and they get within 90 feet of it and they say, this is not going to be good. And so they throw out the anchors. And so we're going to say that's more added to this side of the scale. And in fact, it's so bad at this point. Look at verse number 30. As the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, it got so bad that they would rather jump out than to crash into this island. It would be easier to bail out and accept whatever fate would happen than to face this island and for the ship to crash and for things to be destroyed. And so we know there's still this promise over here, but the circumstances are bad enough now, they're considering quitting. We got to get out of here. We just need to bail. And so we have verse 30 that they're considering just getting out. I can't help but think in heartbreak how many times people have the promises of God, but then when circumstances reach a certain point, they say that's just too much. When they bail out. And they never do get to see all that God has for their life because the circumstances get so heavy. And it's easier to bail than to stick with it. That's where they were in this storm. Well, then you get verse number 31 and you get an added element of this. And Paul said this to the centurion and the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. Now, this is not a saved as in eternal salvation. He's talking about the promise that he gave them earlier that they're going to live. And so he says this, the only way this promise is true is if you stay on the ship. It's the only way it's coming true. If you bail, you are forfeiting the promise. And so the promise is here, but you have to stay. I know you feel like quitting, but if you want to see the promise come true, you've got to stay true. And there are many promises of God that are that way. That if we want to see the benefit of the promise of God and the fulfilling of the promise of God, you don't see it by bailing out. You see it by remaining faithful and trusting God and letting Him develop and letting Him work. We know the passage where He says, tribulation worketh patience. It's these trials that build up our character and our hope and our faith and all of these things that we need to be developed in serving God the way that we should. And so we have the condition of the rocks of verse 29. We add that to this side of the scale. They have the added catch, you have to stay on the ship, added to this side of the scale. And then you look at verse number 41, and falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. If you can picture what's happening here, we know it's a rocky island. The ship hits between some rocks to the point that the front is wedged in, but yet they're still in a place that the waves are so rough and probably have some force behind them and some height behind them to the point that it is destroying the ship. And in case you think this is a little John boat, there's 267 or 276 people on this ship, it tells us earlier. This is a pretty good sized ship, and the front has been wedged in the rocks, and the waves are hitting this ship, and it's breaking apart the back of the ship to the point that he tells them later that you're going to grab the boards that have been broken from the ship. And so I think we would all agree that's a lot of weight on this side. That the circumstances, we are wedged in these rocks and the ship is falling apart while we are on this ship. And so we have the crushing of the ship starting to happen. And now the promise is still there. And I asked you earlier at verse number 27, which side is heavier? Well, now let me ask you again at verse 41. Now which side is heavier? Are you still walking in the hope of the promise? Or have the circumstances now caused you to doubt the promise? Isn't it amazing how the promise doesn't change? And yet because of circumstances, we can start to question and doubt the very promise that gave us hope at one point. And so now these circumstances, in verse number 41, the ship is falling apart. And then we're going to add to this in verse 42. Have you ever found that when you're in this difficult situation, sometimes people say things when they ought to just not say anything? Well, look at verse number 42. Here the circumstances are already bad enough. Verse number 42, the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners. Now you've got somebody giving their own suggestion and their own advice and their own thoughts of what should be done, and as if the circumstances aren't bad enough. And now you have the advice that we ought to just kill the soldiers so that we don't lose any of them. And I think many in here are familiar with the story of Job. Job goes through some trials at the permission of God, and then Job's friends come up, and probably 38 of the 42 chapters of Job are his friends trying to tell him, if you went through this, you must have done something terrible. The only way that you would have lost your house is if you are hiding something, Job. You have some sin, and you're deceiving us, and you're deceiving yourselves. And so even though they are his friends, the counsel they give is not right. It's not good, and they don't understand Job's circumstance. They don't understand how he feels about things. And even though the Lord does use them to help him to remain humble and to keep humble, at one point he says, I've done nothing to deserve this. And then God shows up and reminds him, we've all done something to deserve this. Every one of us. We may not in our own mind think that we've done something to deserve something that bad, but I remind us that the wages of sin is death. It's the cost of being a sinner. Thank God for his grace and for his Son and the salvation and forgiveness that he offers, because without that, it's what we all deserve. And so we have the counsel of others in verse 42. I think we would agree this counsel, we're not going to place it in the bucket over here with the promise. We're adding that to the circumstances. Man, why are you so down? Well, the ship's going to crash. We don't know where. It looks like it's going to be on these rocks, and now the front of the ship is stuck. The back's falling apart. We're not allowed to leave the ship. We have to stay on here. And now they're saying that they ought to just kill us. Anybody want to sign up to be the counselor of that situation? And all we have is the promise that was given before. That's all that we have, and yet the circumstances seem to be really weighing heavy on our scale at this point. And then we have the coming to land. And so now, because the front of the ship is wedged, their plan is they're not going to kill the prisoners, but here's their question. Who here can swim? You don't have to raise your hand. That's what they're saying, but I do appreciate your cooperation. They're saying, who can swim? All those who can swim, jump off and swim to shore. Now let's keep in mind the circumstance of this storm. It's rocks. The waves are strong enough, it's destroying the ship. Earlier in the chapter, it tells us this: they have not seen sun or stars for many days. That's how dark the skies are. And if you've been out away from city lights, you know how bright stars can be. It's a beautiful thing. And here he says, because of the storm, we've not seen sun, we've not seen stars. It's dark. The waves are tall enough and powerful enough to crush a boat with over 200 people on it. The rocks in front of us, it's not sand, it's rocks, and yet he says, jump out and swim. And so that's what some of them do, they jump out. Second group, he says that they're going to grab onto some boards. He says in verse number 43, themselves first, let's see, verse 44, and the rest, some on boards, and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so now the way that you're going to make it through is you're going to swim, or you're going to grab a board knowing you can't swim. That's the only group left. Knowing you can't swim, and you're going to grab a board or a broken piece of the ship, and you're jumping out. And you understand you are at the mercy of the waves at that point. You are holding on, you are at the mercy of the waves, and you've got to make it to shore, and you have to do your best to try to get there. And we have this, at the end of verse number 44, it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. Turns out the promise was true. But let's face it, in the meantime, there probably were a lot of moments they weren't sure if it was going to be true. Circumstances were heavy. As I thought about this a couple weeks ago before we taught on this chapter, and I got kind of focused in on this, and then because of the way my mind thinks, sometimes we don't just look at what they said, but we have to look at what was not said. So by that I mean this. In verse 22, the promise was nobody's going to die. But it didn't say anything about bruises. It didn't say that there wouldn't be some, after making it to shore, that they wouldn't be struggling to catch their breath and all that might come with that scene. I think you can maybe imagine what that might be like, or maybe somebody, a brother or somebody that they had met and wondering where they are and did they make it. And so he says you're going to live, but who knows how difficult that was getting to land and what may have happened on that journey. And so we have this promise that if we stop reading early, we say, I'm so glad we have a promise. But then as life develops, circumstances challenge our belief in the promise. It challenges that. Things happen in our world that make us question promises that we have from God. Things that happen in our own life cause us to question things that we know to be true because it's God. And yet many who once believed and stood firm on who God is and believed God because of life and circumstances find themselves questioning and wondering and uncertain, how much weight can I put in the promise of God? And so then, of course, for me, the challenge is how do we level out the scale? I don't want to walk through life feeling like my circumstances are heavier than the promise. I want to walk through life in faith and trusting God, knowing that the promise is always heavier than the circumstance. There's no exception to that. It is always true. God's promise is always more reliable. It is always more certain than the circumstances that we are in. And so how can I go through life not fearful because of circumstance, but confident because of the promise? And we see here the promise does come true, which is great. If you would, let's go to Psalm chapter 77. And we won't be coming back here to Acts, but I want you to look at Psalm chapter 77. In Psalm chapter 77, and it is a moment where the author is obviously in a place where circumstances are heavy. Matter of fact, verse number 1, he starts off by saying, I cried unto God with my voice, even unto God with my voice. He gave ear unto me, In the day of my trouble, I sought the Lord. So he starts off by telling us, I am in a place of life that is trouble. Circumstances are troublesome. My fear, the uncertainty, it is a troublesome time. And he says it's so troublesome at the end of verse number 2, my soul refused to be comforted. That's how heavy the circumstances were, that if somebody were to say, it'll be okay, don't forget the promise of God. He says it didn't matter. I already knew the promise was there. I knew of the promise, I knew of God, but my circumstances are so heavy that my soul refused to be comforted in knowing that there is a promise of God. I think we would all agree that is a troublesome time when we struggle to even find comfort. So he expresses a little bit, and if you want to see how dark of a place this was, look at verse number 7. Will the Lord cast off forever? And will he be favorable to me no more? That's how he felt in his circumstance. Is God done showing me grace and favor and kindness? Is this just my life now? Are these my circumstances? Is this my cross to bear? Is God done being favorable with me? Verse 8, is his mercy clean gone forever? Doth his promise fail forevermore? Is the promise not even going to come true? Did a promise of God fail? And yet I struggle with this morning, but I pray that we can get to that level of vulnerability to say sometimes carrying around this human nature and this sin nature, we may not say the words out loud, but there can be a part of us because of circumstances that can wonder, am I understanding God's promise right? Because it seems like the way I understand it, it's not happening. Are the promises of God failing? And we don't want to put that on God, and so we'll blame ourselves. Maybe I don't understand it right. Maybe I don't see it right. But in essence, however we want to word it, we're basically saying our circumstances sure are making me question the promise. And that's where he finds himself here in verse number 9. Hath God forgotten to be gracious? Think about the question. He mentioned early in verse number 8, is his mercy clean gone? Is his mercy gone? Is there no more mercy? And is he forgetting to be gracious? God, I thought you were a gracious God. Are you just forgetting me? Are you forgetting to be gracious, to be kind, to show a little bit of love and a little bit of favor? Hath he, verse 9, hath he in anger shut up his tender mercies? Is God just so angry with me, with circumstances, with life, whatever the case may be, that maybe I failed too many times and God just is done with me? Maybe I sinned too many times and maybe I had my chance and this is just the consequence that I have to live with. These are the ways that we think. Maybe I sinned too much and this is what I have to carry. But then he reaches a point that he realizes, even though I don't have any new promise, there are things that I can add to this side of the scale. No matter what circumstances are in my life, and it seems like God gives these things at just the right time to keep things from getting out of balance. And so I want us to look at what he does in Psalm chapter 77. In verse number 10, here's what he says. When I'm in this place, he says this, I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. Here's what he said. Even though this is my story now, one of the things that I can put on this side of the scale is I can remember who it is I'm serving. This isn't just another person who has let me down or could let me down. We're talking about God, our Creator, the Most High. That's the one that we're serving. That's the author of the promise. And I think we would agree, if you're given a promise, the question is, who gave the promise? But when the promise comes from God Himself, even though our circumstances may be rough, we can say, wait a minute, I remember who it is that gave this promise, and it is the living God, and I can put faith in that, and I can put confidence in that, and so I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. And then verse number 11, he says, I will remember the works of the Lord. Not only am I going to remember who it is, I'm going to remember all He's done in the past. The times like Acts chapter 27, when it seemed like the promise of verse 22 to 25 was not going to come true. But then when we reach verse 44, it builds our confidence and it builds our faith, because now we have another story, another testimony where we can help somebody else by saying, I remember a time in my own life, it didn't seem like we were going to make it, but I promise you, God's promises are true. We add to this side of the scale our personal experiences, our confidence in the person of God. We add to this side of the scale the testimonies of other people. It's not just my stories, it's your stories that help me, and it's your testimonies, and it's the things that God has gotten you through that I can add to this side and say, I don't just have a promise, I have my own history, my own experiences. I have the promise from the Most High God, knowing who it is. I have the testimonies of others. And all of a sudden, God gives you these things at a time that helps keep the scale balanced out. I think we've all been in that place when we heard an encouraging word at just the right time. Or you read a chapter of the Bible and it's just what you need for the day. Just when it seems like this side is getting most of the weight, you remember something that got into the past, or you hear the testimony of somebody else, or you're just reminded of who God is. And even though we don't have any new promise to add to this side, there are endless stories, testimonies of who God is. And God brings them at just the right time. Look at what else He does at verse number 12. I will meditate also of all thy work. He says, I'm not just going to remember it, I'm going to think about it. I'm going to focus on it. I'm not going to focus on the circumstance. I'm going to relive what God has done in the past and meditate upon that and remember the details. And that might mean going back and reading times in Scripture when others were faced with fiery furnaces and whales and lions' dens and the storms of the sea and the diseases of the land. And you can see how God's promise continued to be true, and we can be strengthened by that. So we add to this side of the scale all of these things. And then we get to verse number 12. Look at the end of the verse. And I will talk of all thy doings. It's a wonderful thing to be in a place where you know your circumstances are heavy, but yet all you can find yourself doing is talking about the Lord. That's a wonderful place to be. You didn't have any new promise. But yet in the midst of circumstances changing and the weight being added, it seemed like God just continued to add things to that side of the scale. So that even though you have plenty you could talk about, you really just want to talk about how good God is. We're in a unique time in our country. And I believe with all my heart that, and you can agree with this, you can disagree with this. I don't think we'd have anybody who would disagree with this, but I believe with all my heart that the assassination of Charlie Kirk a little over a week ago was a modern day martyr case for our world today. And I believe and I know there's other things going on that we don't know about. I'm not naive to know that there are good men whose lives have been taken, different countries, different places for serving God. I know that's true. But for us in our country, it's been a long time since we've experienced something like this. And it seems like it has added a weight to the circumstance side of being a Christian. And yet, in some miraculous way, we have this horrible event that has happened that obviously God did not want to happen. God did not plan on happening. He knew it was going to happen, but that doesn't mean that he planned it. I love the statement, God saw the sparrow that fell, but it doesn't mean he pushed him out of the tree. God knew this was going to happen. And yet, in the midst of this, it seems like there is this over-optimism of people who are now interested in looking back to the Lord. Isn't that amazing? That something so terrible can happen. And I'll be honest, the first day of that, the scale was pretty lopsided. I'm just speaking honestly. I didn't know how I felt. I was angry, I was hurt. It was all sorts of emotions. But then as you see time go by, you realize God is still keeping his promises. That even in such tragedy, all things can work together for good to them that love him and are the called according to his purpose. It's remarkable. And then we as Christians are faced with the question, what do we do with this unique window of opportunity that's been given to us? You realize right now, if you go into, we were at Applebee's in Oklahoma City, and our waiter came over, and a nice young man, and we were all dressed up. We just came from church on Tuesday night, and he said, "Why are you guys dressed up?" We said, "Oh, we were at a church meeting." "Oh, no." He kind of went about his way. I went up to ask a question, I went to let him know we were ready for our bill. And he waved me over, and he goes, "Are you guys preachers?" I said, "Yes, some of us, my wife mainly." I said, "Yeah, some of us are preachers." And he said, "I went to church last Sunday for the first time since I was 9 years old." He said, "But the church I went to, I think it was a cult." And I said, "Well, what makes you think that?" And he said, "Well, they kept saying we were wrong by worshiping our Father. It was actually God the Mother and all of this." I said, "Well, you're right. That is a cult." And I said, "I tell you what, would you give me your name and your phone number, and I'll have somebody at the church that we're at text you." He said, "I have off this Sunday, and that would be great." Gave me his phone number, gave me his name, He texted him last night. He's going to church today. My point is this. A month ago, we would have been nervous to bring up God in a restaurant. But right now, we have a window that it's acceptable. It's everywhere. It's a curiosity that God has put in mankind through this tragic event. And so I say that to challenge us this morning, and I don't know how it all fits in the message. The Lord has to work that out with your heart. But I say that to say this. I know we have our own scale. But if as Christians, for just this window of opportunity, imagine standing before God and him saying, "I gave 4 weeks where the whole world, not all the world, a large majority of people were open to talk about Christ." What did you do during those 4 weeks? I believe that's a valid question. And I don't think it's coincidence that our outreach was scheduled during this time. Have you ever had a hailstorm go through your neighborhood and then you get 18 people knocking on your door the next day? We're hail specialists. You didn't even know such a thing existed. We're here, a storm. You know what they do? They watch for windows of opportunities and they go in and capitalize on it. I'm not saying we're businessmen, and I know it's a decision in somebody's heart. But I am telling you, I believe we will have to answer to God for what we do at a time when people are open to the conversation. And I cannot challenge us enough. I cannot challenge us enough to allow God to use you. And let's take the scale of the circumstances that were heavy and let's see what God can do with it. So that we look back and we can say that was a tragic event. But wouldn't it be great if we had in our churches 10 years from now, people standing up and saying, it was during that time that I gave my life to the Lord? Wouldn't that be wonderful? And I believe that can happen. I believe with all my heart that can happen.